I never thought much about having a stepsister. When my dad remarried, it was just another change in a long list of things I had to get used to. She moved in with us, bringing her own world into ours, and for a while we existed separately under the same roof. She was different, confident, a little too comfortable breaking rules, and always had this unreadable expression like she knew something no one else did. First, I ignored her. She wasn't exactly friendly, and I wasn't in the mood to force a sibling bond. But things started shifting in ways I didn't expect. It was small at first. The way she'd linger in the doorway when I was in my room, the way her gaze held a second too long, making it impossible to tell if it was intentional or just my imagination. I convinced myself it was nothing, but something about her always felt like a challenge, like she was waiting for a reaction. Late at night, I'd hear her moving around the house when everyone else was asleep. Sometimes she'd pass by my room, pausing just long enough that I'd wonder if she was going to knock. She never did. But that lingering silence stuck with me. It was an unspoken game, and I hated that I was playing along. One night I was lying on my bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the fact that I knew she was awake. The door creaked. I looked up. She was standing there, not saying a word. Just standing in my doorway like she belonged there. My pulse jumped, though I wasn't sure why. "You're still up," she said. Not a question. Just an observation. I nodded, forcing myself to look unimpressed, unaffected. So are you." She smirked but didn't move. "Can I come in?" There was no reason to say no. We lived in the same house, and it wasn't like she hadn't been in my room before. But this felt different. Something about the way she asked, the way she leaned against the doorframe, waiting. I shrugged, acting casual even though my stomach felt tight. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just another random interaction. She wasn't here to talk about something normal. She didn't sit down. Just stood there, eyes scanning my room like she was seeing it for the first time. "Your room is boring," she muttered. "Thanks," I said flatly. She smiled at that, but it wasn't just amusement. There was something else behind it, something teasing, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I swallowed hard, suddenly too aware of the fact that we were alone, that the house was silent, that she had closed the door when she didn't need to. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But everything had shifted, and I knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, nothing would be the same after tonight. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she moved slowly around my room, touching things without asking, her fingers grazing the edge of my desk, the back of my chair. It wasn't curiosity. It was deliberate, like she was testing how much I would let her get away with. I tried to ignore it, acting like I didn't care. But the air felt heavier, charged with something I didn't want to name. I should have told her to leave. I should have made some excuse, turned my back, done anything other than just sit there watching her. But I didn't. She stopped near my bed, running a hand over the blanket like she was thinking about something. Then, without asking, she sat down. Not at the edge, not far away. Closer than she needed to. Close enough that I could feel the heat of her presence. "You always this quiet?" she asked. I exhaled, forcing a smirk. "You always this nosy?" She laughed, but it was soft, knowing. "Only when it's interesting." She turned slightly, facing me now, one leg pulled up onto the bed, her knee barely touching my leg. The movement was subtle, maybe even innocent, but it didn't feel that way. I swallowed hard, my mind screaming at me to keep this normal, to not let my thoughts go where they were already heading. "You act like you don't notice," she said after a beat. I frowned. "Notice what?" She tilted her head, eyes locked on mine like she was waiting for me to admit something I didn't want to say out loud. "Me." Forced a scoff. "What are you talking about?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, enough that I felt the shift, the heat of her skin near mine. "You know exactly what I mean." My pulse pounded. This wasn't some harmless teasing anymore. This was something else, something dangerous. My brain was screaming at me to shut this down, to put space between us, to remind both of us who we were supposed to be to each other. Instead, I stayed there, frozen, every muscle tense. I could feel the unspoken dare in her posture, in her eyes. She was waiting to see what I'd do, if I'd pull away, if I'd break first. I exhaled sharply, shifting slightly just to put an inch of space between us. You should go to bed. Her lips twitched, amused. Should I? Yes. She didn't move right away. For a moment, I thought she was going to push further, cross the invisible line we were already towing. My throat felt dry, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Then, just as suddenly as she had sat down, she stood up. She didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge the moment that had just passed between us. She only smirked, walking toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she glanced back over her shoulder. Her voice quiet but filled with something I couldn't name. Good night. And just like that, she was gone, leaving the air thick with everything left unsaid. The days after that night felt different. She didn't mention it, and neither did I, but something had shifted between us. It was in the way she looked at me a second too long, the way she brushed past me in the hallway when there was plenty of space to walk. The tension wasn't loud, but it was there, lingering in every interaction. One evening, when the house was unusually quiet, I heard a soft knock at my door. I knew who it was before I even turned my head. I could have ignored it. Should have. But I didn't. I opened the door, and there she was, standing too close again, like she knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't wait for an invitation this time. She just walked in, the scent of her perfume trailing behind her. I closed the door, my pulse already picking up. What do you want? She turned, arms crossed, a slight smirk on her lips. You've been avoiding me. I exhaled, shaking my head. I haven't. She stepped closer, forcing me to either hold my ground or move back. I stayed still. She tilted her head, watching me like she was figuring something out. Liar, she murmured. Clenched my jaw. You shouldn't be here. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, fingers grazing my wrist, just enough contact to send a jolt through me. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't casual. It was a choice. I swallowed hard. We can't do this. She didn't pull away. Then stop me. My breath caught. Every logical thought screamed at me to step back, to say something that would end this before it got worse. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop her. The distance between us vanished. My heartbeat hammered in my ears as I felt the warmth of her body close to mine. Her breath soft against my skin. This was the line, the point where there was no turning back. Her fingers tightened slightly around my wrist, her gaze flicking to my lips before meeting my eyes again. She was waiting, daring me to make the final move. I didn't think. I just let it happen. The moment stretched, every second heavier than the last. It was reckless, selfish, wrong, but none of that mattered. Not in that moment. By the time reality hit, it was already too late. I pulled back, breathing unevenly, my mind racing. Her expression didn't change. She just watched me, waiting for regret to set in, for me to take it back. I didn't. Instead, she gave me one last look, something unreadable flickering in her eyes before she turned and walked away, leaving behind the weight of everything we had just done. The next morning, everything felt off. The air was heavier, like the house itself knew something had changed. I went through the motions. Breakfast, small talk, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. She was there, sitting across from me at the table, acting like nothing had happened. No stolen glances, no secret smirks. Just silence. It should have made things easier, but it didn't. I kept waiting for her to say something, to acknowledge the line we had crossed. But she never did. And somehow that was worse. Later that day I heard my name. My father's voice, firm, serious. I turned the corner and saw him standing in the hallway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. My stomach dropped. Is there something you need to tell me? His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. I forced my face to stay neutral. Oh. Why? He studied me for a long second. Your stepsister has been acting strange. And so have you. My throat went dry. I don't know what you're talking about. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Just be careful. I don't want any trouble in this house. I nodded, walking past him before he could see the tension in my face. That night she found me again. This time she didn't knock. She just slipped into my room like she belonged there, closing the door softly behind her. They know, I whispered. She shrugged, unconcerned. They suspect. That's not the same thing. My hands clenched at my sides. This has to stop. She tilted her head, watching me. Do you really want it to? I hesitated. That second of silence was all the answer she needed. She stepped closer, voice softer now. We could pretend it never happened. I exhaled sharply. Can you? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the door, pausing before opening it. They won't find out unless you want them to. Her eyes lingered on mine for a beat too long before she slipped out, disappearing down the hall like she had never been there at all. I sat on the edge of my bed, head in my hands. There was no undoing what had been done. The question wasn't whether it would happen again. The question was when.